This is Research Like a Pro, Episode 26, U.S. Census Research, Part 2. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Welcome to Research Like a Pro. We're excited to be here today talking about census records, Part 2. I'm Nicole.
And I'm Diana.
And today we are going to talk more about how to analyze the information that you find in a census record. But first, we have a review.
This is KEYSTR2263. This person says, when you know better, you do better. This quote by Maya Angelou comes to mind each time I listen to a new episode of Research Like a Pro genealogy podcast. The mother-daughter team of Diana Elder and Nicole Dyer guides listeners through the family research process in a down-to-earth, storytelling fashion. Using examples from their own experiences, they share the tools and methods that they have used to get past their personal brick walls. After 20 years of treating my own family research as little more than a hobby, I now have the tools and inspiration to emulate the pros thanks to this podcast. Thank you so much for that review. I love to hear that things that we are sharing are helping other people.
That was really nice. And if you want to leave us a review, also go ahead and go to iTunes or Stitcher and leave a review there or comment on the blog post. And if you ask a question, we will try to answer that on the podcast. All right, so let's dive right into analyzing a census record. We have 4 simple steps that you can do to gather everything from the census form and use that information to jumpstart your research and really find more information and make a list of future research to go forward and do. So let's talk about each one of these 4 steps. So here's the 4 steps, and then we'll talk about each one. Number 1 is abstract. Number 2 is ask questions. Number 3, form hypotheses. And then number 4, list other records to search. So Diana, tell us about number 1. Why do we need to make a complete abstract of the census info?
We want to make sure that we are getting all the information, and we talked a lot in the last episode about the different information that's taken from year to year. So many times those are the things that lead us to more information on the family. Those are clues. So we want to take note of everything, the occupations, the land and property values. Were they able to read or write? Did the mother have more children? So many things that we need to know. So I like to use a table in a Google Doc to list all the information, and I copy it down just exactly as it's written on the census. We might be really tempted to change the name to be the correct spelling as we understand it, but it's important to keep the spelling as it is actually written in the census. For one thing, it'll help us to find that census record again, because that's the way it's going to be indexed from the spelling that was there. It also gives us a list of spelling variations for the surname. We can see whether our ancestors spelled it that way or not for the census taker. It was another way that people thought the name could be spelled. So we're going to use an example of the household of George W. Dillard in 1850, which, as we all know, is the first census that names everybody in the household. So it's so exciting to actually get the names finally of the females and the other younger males in the census. And this census was relatively simple. This just gives us gender, age, occupation, and birthplace. So we don't even have family relationships. But even though we don't have those, it can help us fill in the blanks. And then using that census with other records, we can put together the family. So I'm just going to give you a little brief outline of this family. We have George W. Dillard. He's the head of household, and he's 68 years old. He has no occupation, and he's born in Virginia. And then secondly is Martha Dillard, age 42, Virginia. So notice that difference, 68, and then she's 42. She's in the spot for a wife, but it doesn't have relationship, remember. Then we have Columbus Dillard, who's age 21. He's a clerk. He was born in Georgia. We have Alonzo Dillard, who was 15, also born in Georgia. And then we have a Leonidas, Love that name. Age 9, born in Alabama. And Sonora, age 7, born in Alabama. So I didn't mention before, but this census is taken in Alabama, Macon County. So we've got a variety of birthplaces. Virginia for the 2 older people, then we've got the 2 older sons in Georgia, and then the 2 younger people in Alabama. So there are a lot of things we can notice here. Nicole, what do you think? What kind of questions would you ask when looking at the census?
Well, I noticed that George is listed as 26 years older than Martha. So I'm wondering if that is his wife, was this a second marriage for him? Because he could be her father.
Yeah.
And then I also noticed that there are 6 years in between Alonzo and Columbus. So those are the first 2 of the children that seem like they could be children, but there's quite a big gap there in between them. And then there were also the younger 2, boy and girl, Leonidas and Zenora, and I'm wondering, they were born in Alabama. The older 2 were born in Georgia, so the family must have moved, I'm guessing. I'm kind of wondering about the migration and what's going on with that. Because of the gap in the ages, I'm wondering if there's more children in the family that aren't here.
Good. So we've got a lot of questions here. Just from looking at that census, we can get a lot of ideas for future research. So what I like to do when I look at a family like this, I've got all these questions going through my head. I'm really trying to analyze what's going on here. I like to make an informed guess. So I call this form a hypothesis. So for instance, George, I'm going to hypothesize, was born about 1782 based on his age in the census. And I'm going to hypothesize that he was probably married first between 1802 and 1812, just simply because he would have been 20 in 1802 and he would have been 30 in 1812. So men generally married for the first time between the age of 20 and 30. And I'm going to hypothesize that he was married either in Virginia or Georgia. Because we've got those older 2 boys who were in Georgia, we have no way of knowing yet whether he got married before he moved to Georgia or after, but I am going to give my hypothesis that it could have been either. And then I'm going to hypothesize that Martha was born about 1808, and if she was born about 1808, she wouldn't have been married until she was probably in her 20s, which would have been about 1824. And I'm going to hypothesize that George's first wife probably died and he married Martha. And that was probably in Georgia. Now I'm looking at those 2 older boys, born 1829 and 1835, both in Georgia. So I'm guessing George would have been living in the state of Georgia on the 1830 census. So I could possibly look for him there. And then I'm going to guess that they had moved to Alabama by 1841, where the next 2 boys were born. And so maybe he was in the 1840 census in Alabama. You know, the move, we can't tell for sure. So I'm also thinking that because women typically had children every 2 years, those gaps would point to some possible missing children. So I have a lot of different ideas, and I can make a lot of educated guesses, which is what a hypothesis is, based on the information in the census.
Yeah, that's a really good idea to use the birthplace of the children to create a kind of a timeline of migration and then look in those places for additional census records. Like you said, with checking the 1830 census, that makes sense because Columbus, who looks like he's a son to George Dillard, was born 20 years prior in Georgia. So it makes sense that the family probably lived in Georgia in 1830. So that's something that we can all do with our 1850 censuses, is just make a timeline of migration by using where the children were born.
Right. So after we have our questions, we've done our analysis, now we actually have to write down, as part of our research planning, what other records we're going to search. So in this case, I want to look for a marriage record in Georgia for that marriage of Martha and George about 1824. I want to look for an 1860 census to see if George is still alive. He would be 78, so that's questionable. I could look for cemetery records in Alabama around his county that he's living in, which is Macon County. And then I could go looking for those earlier census records. We'd have 1820, 1830, 1840. And even though we're not going to get names of all the household, I could start to match up the people that I know from the 1850 census in those earlier census records and see if the ages, the tick marks, things align, which would also give me clues about those other children if I can see other people in the household. And then I can also go back to early Georgia marriage records and see if I can find George in a first marriage. So there are lots and lots of great things that I could search for just from analyzing this one census.
So I know you actually did the research on this family and found out a lot about them. Want to just give us a recap?
Sure. So I did find that George Dillard was originally married to another woman in, I believe, 1804 in Georgia, and her name was Margaret Armour. And I think that they are the parents of my Cynthia Dillard. That's my hypothesis right now. And they had several children. I found him in the 1810 and 1820 censuses, and he has several children in the household, one of which would be my Cynthia. And then in 1830, he is a noticeably younger woman. And so I found his other marriage to Martha. And I found 1860, he is not alive, but I found those children, Zenora, Leonidas, and Alonzo and Columbus, living in the household of an older brother who was not on the 1850 census. So George did die in 1854 and found his tombstone, which gives his birth date in Virginia. So I did find a lot more information on this family, and it was really fun to see how the census, even though it's a little snapshot in time, how it really did provide pretty accurate information for this family.
Wow. Yeah. And those names were fun too. Columbus, Alonzo, Leonidas, and Zenora.
They are. And Leonidas actually is a clue to my Cynthia Dillard because she names one of her youngest sons Thomas Leonidas, which is an unusual name. And I keep coming back to that thinking, oh man, I think she really does belong to this family. I just have no direct evidence yet. I'm building a case of all indirect evidence for Cynthia belonging to this family.
Well, from what I've read, your case is very convincing.
Thank you.
All right. So, for the second half of our podcast today, now that we've talked about analyzing a census record, let's talk more about the non population schedules. As genealogists, we use the population schedules so much that we sometimes might forget to check the non population schedules. There were several different kinds, and the government wanted to know all about the citizens who had certain things, like the citizens who died, the citizens who were veterans, the people who were enslaved, and the people who had mental or physical limitations, and also all of the agriculture and manufacturing data for a community. So that's why all these non-population schedules were created. So let's just talk about each one briefly. Let's see. First, let's talk about mortality schedules from 1850 to 1885.
Okay, so mortality schedules, those are going to give you people who died the previous 12 months. So you would have people who were dying in 1849 listed on the 1850 mortality schedule, or people who died in 1859 listed on the 1860 mortality schedule. So if you are lucky enough to have a person who died that year previous, you're going to get a whole boatload of information. You get their name, you get why they died, you get the date of their death, where they were when they were dying. So really helpful information about their death. And I have had some research pull up these people, and sometimes it's the only other record you have of their death. I had a client case where the individual is mentioned in exactly 3 records of his lifetime: the 1850 census, his marriage record in the middle of the 1850s, and his mortality schedule in 1859. And that is it. And that's all we have to base our search for his ancestors on.
Wow.
So that 1859 mortality schedule was actually very valuable, helping us figure out what happened to him. So these also 6 states had a mortality schedule in 1885. So if you're lucky enough to have any ancestors in Colorado, Florida, Nebraska, New Mexico, North Dakota, and South Dakota, go check 1885. That's kind of a small group, but that could be really illuminating for your ancestors.
Yes.
A good place to find these is on Ancestry.com, which has them indexed. So it's worth it to put in your surname at least, and maybe you'll find maybe not your direct line ancestor, but collateral relatives, and flesh out the story of your family that way.
Yeah, I have a dire ancestor from my husband's side who was listed on the 1880 mortality schedule. And it was really helpful because he died in 1879 in December. So it tells us what he died of. And it also says when he was born. Well, at least we could calculate it from how old he was. But it kind of conflicted with the other information I had. And so I had to ask myself, is this information primary about his age or secondary? Who was the informant? And as I thought about it, the informant was probably his wife or one of his children, and they were not there at his birth. So although they should know how old he was when he died, they may not have known. Maybe he didn't even know because his age jumped around so much on the census years.
Interesting. And you have to remember that the census was not taken on the day they died. The census is taken, could be a whole year later.
Right.
And the family or the informant is just recording what they remember.
That's a good point. Yeah, so it was interesting. It did tell me that he lived in Hawkins County his whole life, according to the informant, which had been in question too, because some censuses said he was born in North Carolina, but most of them said he was born in Tennessee. So the mortality schedule there was helpful for kind of determining what the family thought about their father and husband.
Right. And we just have to remember it is a census, completely dependent upon who was the informant.
But it was really good information about his death. I think that was probably the most accurate information on there, why he died and about when that was.
Yeah. Good. That's a great example. Well, we also have veteran schedules that we talked a little bit about on the regular censuses, how they have little tick marks for, if they were veterans of certain wars, but we have entire veteran schedules. So tell us a little bit about those, Nicole.
Well, the 1840 veteran schedule, when it was taken, the enumerators listed all the living pensioners of the Revolutionary War or other military service, and they just did this on the back of the population schedule. What they did was they would list the pensioners' ages and the persons with whom they were living. So sometimes that person might not be a head of household. So you might get lucky and have a person who was living in someone else's home listed as the veteran. All right, so if you want to find out if your Revolutionary War pensioner was listed in this veteran schedule, then there is a database on Ancestry.com called Revolutionary War Pensioner Census 1841. Then, of course, we mentioned in our last episode the 1890 veteran schedules are very helpful for finding out about Civil War veterans who fought for the Union and some Confederate soldiers who snuck on there also. This was a one-time schedule that was conducted to help Union veterans find compatriots to assist in the procurement of pensions. And the government wanted to identify them also just to know their future payment of pensions. So you can look through these to find a lot of the veterans from the Civil War, but some of the schedules are missing. So if your veteran was from the state of Alabama through Kansas and half of Kentucky, then those are missing. But you can check the Ancestry database entitled the 1890 Veterans Schedules. And then there's also a FamilySearch collection for this too. It's called United States Census of Union Veterans and Widows of the Civil War 1890. And don't forget to check your Confederate veterans too, because they might just be listed on accident with their name crossed out.
Great. So, of course, if we find our ancestor on an 1890 veteran schedule, then we're going to want to make sure we check for a pension and see if we have a pension file for them. If they fought for the Union Army, then there's going to be United States federal pension for them at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and those can be anywhere from 20 to 100 pages and give you so much information about the pensioner's life. So always look for the pension if you see that they were a veteran. And if they were a Confederate veteran and accidentally listed on that schedule, you'll have to look for the pension records in each southern state, because the federal government was not going to give a pension to anybody who fought in the Confederacy. The southern states did that on their own. So another type of special schedule are the slave schedules, and these are 1850 and 1860. So prior to 1850, all of the enslaved individuals in a household were listed after the free individuals. If you are looking at your ancestor on, say, the 1840 census, you'll need to go to the next page. So on the digitized microfilm, you'll want to click the little next button, and then that will have the slave schedule. And you'll be able to see how many enslaved individuals were in the household. And they're designated by female or male and their ages. But finally, by 1850 and 1860, they used a whole separate slave schedule. They give the name and residence of the slave owner and the number of slaves, the age, gender, and specify the color. So whether they were black or mulatto. And unfortunately, they don't do the names, which would be so very helpful for African American research. But if you are doing African American research, the schedules can still give clues to a family. And using the 1870 census and probate records or court records, you may be able to put together families from using the information given in the slave schedules.
Like we mentioned in the last podcast episode, the 1880 census had a schedule called Defective, Dependent, and Delinquent Schedules. And this was the only year that the federal government decided to do a separate schedule for this. And they used the following terms to describe the people in the census: insane, idiots, deaf mutes, blind, paupers or indigent persons, homeless children, and prisoners. And yeah, those terms are offensive today, but that was the terminology used in the census. And if you think your ancestor might be listed on that, you can check the ancestry collection, which is entitled U.S. Federal Census 1880 Schedules of Defective, Dependent, and Delinquent Classes. So who knows what you might find there, but don't overlook that census if you think your ancestors might be on it.
Yeah, and I have my great grandfather, Doc Harris, his sister, he was the youngest in the family, so it'd be an older sister. And she was put into an asylum there in Texas sometime in the, I think, 1880s, and she is on that census. It makes me really, really sad to read that and to think of what their lives might have been like and how they were termed. But again, we have to use it as clues that if we have someone that's mentioned there, then there's other records we can go find. Perhaps there are records still surviving for, if they were a prisoner, a prison record, or if there was an asylum, there may not be anything surviving from those years, but you never know, and it's always worth it to go see what you can find. Another type of census that's really fun if you had farmer ancestors is the agricultural schedule. They also had manufacturing, industry, and social statistics. These are all these different type of things that the government wanted to know what people were doing for their living. They wanted to get as much information as they could about the country. And I love the agricultural schedules because they will detail out the specific kind of crops, how much the ancestor made the year before, 50 bushels of sweet potatoes, 100 bushels of onions, or whatever they're growing. And it's really illuminating to see what specific crops they were growing. It's kind of fun because I grew up on a farm in Idaho, and the farmers there had great big farms. They grew like basically 3 crops. You grew potatoes, beets, or grain. Sometimes you did all 3, but you only did a few things. So when I look at my ancestors' agricultural schedules, they raised like 10 different types of things. They were really broad with what they grew. And it's just so fun to kind of take a step back in time and imagine what life might have been like for your ancestor.
It is.
So always good to check those.
Yes, and I actually got some helpful information as I was cross-referencing the agricultural census with the land records for the Dyer's ancestors in Hawkins, Tennessee. John Robert Dyer did not own land in 1850. It looks like he was just renting. And then he had a deed of trust that year where he deeded all of his personal property, like his cows and sheep, and he actually lists all of them in that deed of trust for some land that he was buying. So I cross-referenced that with what he put on the agricultural census, and it was interesting to see how many animals he had at both different years, because it was in 1850, and then the deed of trust was in the middle of the 1850s, and then there was another agricultural census in the 1870s. So it was interesting to kind of follow him through time and see what he had. And they were growing Irish potatoes, and they had a lot of livestock slaughtered that totaled over $200. So it was a really interesting schedule. I recommend it.
I think it's really great to expand our knowledge of our ancestors besides relationships. So many times we just want to get the relationships, dates, and places, but finding out more about their social history can give us clues that we need to break through brick walls, actually. It's good to explore all these different types of census records. So I mentioned on the previous website a couple of really great books that I love, but a couple of websites that I want to mention today are really, really helpful in doing census research. And one of those is the Atlas of Historical County Boundaries. This is hosted by the Newberry Library, and it helps you understand the boundary changes. So if you cannot find your ancestor in a certain county, you need to really check and make sure you understand the boundary changes, because perhaps they were enumerated in the parent county of the county that you think they should have been in. So check that out. That's really fun. It's interactive. It's very educational, and just one that you should bookmark and use all the time. Another fun census website is called Census Finder, and it's a directory of free census records, and it gives you over 49,000 links to census records. So the Census Finder will let you look state by state and see if that state had a state census. Some of the states did a census every year or on the off years, so like 85, 1885, 1895. And guess what? The 1890 United States schedule is missing. So if you have a state that did an 1885 census and an 1895 census, you have a great resource to fill in the blanks of that missing 20 year from 1880 to 1900. And I have found several estates that do that. Several projects I've done have had those intermediary state censuses. Also, if you are researching in a state before statehood, there are territorial censuses. So Census Finder will help you figure out all those extra states and territorial censuses for the area that you're researching. And it will also give you a link to those special censuses that we've been talking about. Not everything survived for every place of those agricultural and the different types of schedules, the non-population schedules. So Census Finder will help you put in a location and then show you what's available, what's surviving, and where to find it. And then one other really helpful website that helps you make birth year calculations. Have you ever felt this kind of brain dead when you're working and you're maybe in the 1840 census and it says, oh, your ancestor was aged 30 to 39, and you're thinking, okay, when was he born? I can't think anymore. I can't do the math. So you can use this great website. It's called 1790 to 1840 Census Birth Year Calculations, and you just get to put in the range for the tick mark, and it will give you the range for your ancestor's birth year. You know, you may like figuring that out on your own or have a calculator, but sometimes it's just nice to have a little tool like a website that just helps you find that really quick.
Those are really good websites. Thank you for sharing. Well, to finish up today, we have a few tips for how to search for census records. Sometimes it's easy to find census records for your ancestors, but then when you get that one census year where you just cannot find your ancestor, it is so frustrating. So we've picked up a few tips along the way, and I'm sure you have too. Here's some things that we suggest to do. So the first thing is to not assume that the ancestor's name will be spelled the way that you expect it to be. Maybe his name was misspelled, maybe it was misheard or written down wrong. So you might have to search without the surname and just search for the first name, or search for alternative spellings for the surname. Maybe you could even create a list of alternative spellings for the surname that you've seen on different records, or you could just make them up. You know, if you heard that name, how would you spell it? Especially for those difficult names that are from different countries. Another thing you can do is use wildcards to pick up name variants. So an asterisk matches 0 or more characters. And if you don't know what the end of the name was, you can just put the first half of the surname and then an asterisk. And then it will pick up all the different name variants that have different spellings like EN, ON, AN, and that kind of thing. And then for a question mark, that's a wild card that matches just one single character. And the only restrictions are that either the first or the last character must be a non-wildcard character. So just remember that you have to put in some actual letters. So you could put in a question mark in between S and N if you didn't know which vowel it was. And the names must contain at least 3 non-wildcard characters. So those are your tips for searching with wildcards, and we will put those into the census cheat sheet for you. And then also you can try doing some no-name searches. Like you just put in the birthplace and the residence and the age that you're looking for, and then just see what names come up. If they were indexed really incorrectly, then you might notice, oh, that looks weird, but those do match everything else I'm looking for. Then you can also search for a sibling or a brother who has an unusual given name. And this works well if your ancestor has a really common name and you're getting too many search results. Say your ancestor's name is John, but his brother's name is Leonidas. If you search for Leonidas, it might be easier to narrow down which family is the correct family. And then another tip is to use multiple census websites. There were different indexers in FamilySearch than in Ancestry, so you might be able to find a better index on one of the other websites. So just check multiple websites if you're having a hard time. And they also have different search engines, so they might have different results. And then when all else fails, just browse the actual pages of the county where you think your family was living in and look through all those images and pages for that area and just see who's living there. You might be surprised that you find them and you can read the name, but the indexer just couldn't read it. And then you might try to get better at interpreting handwriting and look for those letters somewhere else on the page to kind of get familiar with this person's handwriting to see how they wrote the letters and whatnot.
Yeah, those are all great tips, and I use all of those repeatedly when I'm doing census searching. It becomes kind of a game, trying to outsmart the indexers or the census takers and figure out where our people are. So what do you do when you actually find your census? Or what should your strategy be with census research? Well, I like to encourage everyone to locate every census that you can find for your ancestor. You'll want to take every single clue off of it. So, you might want to do a table and put in there, how old he is in each census or where he was born in each census, especially if he's a tricky ancestor and you can't figure out where he came from. Sometimes putting things in a table will help to illuminate some of the information and help you make sense of it. When I find a census, I like to download that image and save it in my own computer file to my ancestor's name. And I have a protocol for renaming it. So I immediately right-click on it in my downloads folder. I get rid of all the little gobbledygook that's in the file name, and I rename it something like 1860 Census, Thomas B. Royston, Chambers County, Alabama. I have a protocol. I do date, type of record, name, and location. And then when I put those images into my computer file under Thomas B. Royston's name, they magically are sorted chronologically, and it becomes a little timeline of his records. And it's so much easier for me just to really quickly go to my own database and click on a record than to go find it on FamilySearch or Ancestry and wait for the website to load up. I have it just right there on my computer. So I do like to save these images of the census records so that I can go back to them over and over, because I do. I go back to them over and over trying to find more information about them. I also save a link to the census in my research log because often I like to go back and look at the neighbors. Who's living on the pages before, who's living on the pages after, and I have to actually get to the digital location for that. So download, keep a link in your research log, transcribe the information into a table. You may even want to write up a little report about the census records of an ancestor. So many different things you can do with the census. I would just encourage everyone to try a little experiment if you haven't done this before. Choose one ancestor and go look for every census of their lifetime and see what you can find new that you maybe missed before.
That's a great challenge. And then you can download our cheat sheet to help you along the way. And we will put a link to that in the show notes so that you can get that and download it and print it out to help you remember everything that we talked about. So that's it for our episode about census records. And we hope that you learned something that can help you find your ancestors.
Bye-bye, everyone, and have fun searching the census for your ancestors.
Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.